So we have the federal Liberals promising to help out millennials and their dream of getting into the housing market. Should they even get involved, or are there other ways to make housing more affordable? For more on this, we're joined now by UBC Associate Professor Tom Davidoff. Good to see you, Tom.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so we've heard Mr. Morneau give some pretty vague pronouncements of wanting to help out millennials. It's an election year, probably appeals to millennials and their parents as well. But should the federal government even be trying to make this kind of move?
Well, your last speaker made some good points. If you've got 5 millennials duking it out, bidding on a condo, the last thing you want to do as a government is say, hey, whoever bids the highest gets a prize. And that would essentially be what you might be doing if they were to say first-time homeowners get extra cash. You'd be encouraging people to get into markets that don't have enough supply. You're just bidding up prices and transferring money to owners. So you want to be very cautious with that. And of course, you don't have a problem in every housing market. There are other steps they can take, though. For example, they could say if in 2018 or 19 you were a taxpayer in one of a few expensive cities, we're going to write a check to you, and you can use it how you want just to soften the blow. You could change inter-provincial transfers so that Ontario and BC get some acknowledgement that they're struggling with housing.
Now, is that where it becomes tricky, too, catering policy, that specifically? I mean, the criticism on the other side is you pull one lever for the whole country. It doesn't make any sense because the markets are all different. But if you start actually helping out people who want to live in the priciest markets, then other people are going to start crying foul, saying, wait a minute, because I chose to live in Cambridge, Ontario, I'm not getting any help.
Right, and even worse, you encourage people, if you dangle cash to people if they move to BC, you encourage people to move to places where there isn't enough housing supply. So possibly you do it retroactively. If you were a taxpayer at some prior date, that gets into some fairness. So anything you do is going to be complicated, but what you want to do is be very careful about providing people incentives to overpay for housing, as your last speaker mentioned. Longer term, the government has more options. And I think as long as interest rates stay low, getting the government into the business of rental housing would be a sensible solution. But of course, that's not going to deliver anything prior to elections coming up.
Yesterday, I was talking to the Mortgage Professionals of Canada, and they want the government to ease up on the stress test and perhaps target that to a certain cohort, whether it's a price point for the real estate or whether it's an age group or first-time buyer, millennial, and just ease up on that 200 basis points, maybe take it down to 75. Does that make any sense, or is there danger in that as well?
Well, there is danger. Again, when you've got that room full of millennials bidding on the same condo, if you tell them, hey, if you stretch a little bit further, we're going to provide mortgage insurance for you to do so, you're just encouraging them to bid more for the property. On the other hand, you are giving them a bit of assistance when they're battling against boomers or downsizers or investors for that condo. So I think it's smart to have the stress test in. I don't think you want to stimulate demand and put taxpayers at greater risk in a hot market.
Now, the homebuyers plan is another avenue that people can use to get into the market by taking, money out of their RSPs. But there is a limit. There is a threshold. If they played with that and raised the limit on that, would that be a sensible solution? Obviously, you're taking money out of your long-term savings to do that.
Well, once again, you're encouraging those millennials who are largely competing against each other for the same condos to stretch themselves further, to sacrifice retirement for today's purchase. And a lot of the benefit goes then to the seller of the condo rather than the buyer. So again, in the longer term, the answer is more supply of both rental and condos.
Is there then, and as Patty and I were saying before you and I had our conversation, there's no easy answers. What do you think they can do, if anything?
Well, again, in the short run, the answer is probably some kind of transfer to people who, based on age and where they worked, or you've never owned a home. So if in 2018 you were working in Toronto or Vancouver, maybe you're under 30 or you never owned a home, you get a check. or you get a check that has to be used to go into an RRSP, something like that. So you're not pushing people to overspend on housing, you're not pushing people into the more expensive markets, but you're providing assistance for people who've been part of the workforce and struggling for housing there. That's the short term, the very short term. In the longer term, I think as long as interest rates are low, the feds ought to really consider expanding what they're doing through CMHC already, which is to get more involved in the rental market. Taxpayers may be able to borrow at low rates, provide rental housing that's badly needed, and get good rates of return. And the feds are in a good position to bully local governments and tell them enough of the single-family zoning. When land is tens of millions of dollars an acre, the only way you get to affordability is with multifamily housing.
When we pull back the lens on all the changes we've seen in the past couple of years, do you think that the government and the policymakers at all the different levels played their hand right?
I think here in BC and Ontario, certainly we have shifted the tax burden away from people who live and work here towards people who own property but don't live and work here. I think that was smart. You're starting to see municipalities, certainly Vancouver, be more aggressive about upzoning and creating more supply, which is smart. The feds, I think the stress test was probably the right thing to do to both protect taxpayers and cool down overheated housing markets. But of course, as we've mentioned, that's a blunt instrument in a lot of ways. I think some kind of transfers may make sense to soften the blow on millennials unable to buy. And again, getting the federal government more involved in housing supply, both as an investor and waving a stick around at municipalities that have overly protectionist zoning.
Well, thanks for joining us, Tom. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
That was UBC Associate Professor Tom Davidoff.